What if the man who built an empire with cold precision suddenly opened his mansion to 5 strangers from the streets? What if that decision shattered his world and theirs? This is not a story about wealth. It's about what happens when power, pain, and love collide. Get ready to question everything you believe about family. Subscribe now and drop in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The rain hit the glass like a ticking clock. Jonathan Crane sat alone in his penthouse office, a silent kingdom perched above Manhattan. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Inside, only the sterile hum of machines accompanied the man once revered and feared as the architect of high finance. 68 years old, twice divorced, no children, no softness. His life was a fortress of numbers, contracts, and silence, until the doctor uttered 2 sentences that turned it all into dust. Stage 4. 3 months, maybe less. Jonathan didn't flinch. Not in front of the doctor, not on the ride home, not even as he poured himself a scotch older than some of his board members. But when he stood before the portrait of his father, an imposing oil painting hung above the fireplace, something cracked. "You were wrong," he whispered. "Winning isn't everything. Not when there's no one left to remember you did." The decision came fast. Irrational by every metric he once held sacred. He didn't consult his lawyers. He didn't call his sister. He simply walked into a shelter on 9th Avenue the next day and asked for 5 names. Marcus, Eli, Ezra, Theo, Caleb. 5 boys, none over 18. No last names that mattered, no homes, no trust. No reason to believe the billionaire who showed up in a black car meant anything good. They didn't smile when he told them. They didn't cry either. They stared, flat-eyed and guarded. Caleb, the youngest, blinked rapidly, like the air had been knocked out of him. Marcus stepped forward first, not to thank, but to ask, "What's the catch?" "There's no catch," Jonathan replied, his voice low. "Just time. I don't have much of it." The media reacted within hours. "Crane has lost his mind," screamed one tabloid. "Finance king turns foster dad?" questioned another. Cable news ran expert panels dissecting his decision. Twitter exploded with jokes, outrage, theories. His mansion, once a place of absolute privacy, became a zoo. Inside, the boys wandered hallways wider than their old entire apartments. They didn't speak much. They didn't trust him. They didn't trust each other. They ate in silence, slept with one eye open, kept their backpacks near. Marcus watched everyone like a chessboard. Eli and Ezra, quiet twins with fast fingers and sharper minds, turned one of the guest rooms into a DIY tech lab. Theo painted silently in the corner of the solarium, using leftover canvases from Jonathan's late second wife. Caleb followed the butler, nervously asking questions he never finished. Meredith Crane descended like a winter storm. She wore navy silk and disdain like armor. "You've gone senile," she said without emotion. "This stunt? It's beneath you, Jonathan, and I won't let you destroy the family legacy." He didn't rise from his chair. "It's not your legacy to protect." Within days, she filed for a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation. Her legal team launched a campaign to declare him mentally unfit. She appeared on television, voice honeyed, eyes cold. "I love my brother. That's why I'm doing this." At the same time, the boardroom began to tremble. Old allies questioned his stability. Shareholders panicked. Meredith courted them carefully, promising return to normalcy once Jonathan was sidelined. Inside the house, the atmosphere turned brittle. The boys felt it, the tension in every staff interaction, the surveillance, the way Meredith's investigators interviewed them under the pretense of social check-ins. Marcus, suspicious and precise, started digging. He found spreadsheets, balance sheets, fluctuations in offshore assets, discrepancies he couldn't ignore. Late one night, he walked into Jonathan's study holding a tablet. "Your company is about to sink, quietly. But if you sell off Section A investments by Friday, you'll dodge it." Jonathan looked up, pale and slow from a recent hospital visit. "And how would you know that?" "I paid attention on the streets. You watch people, their spending, their moods, their patterns. Same thing here, just more zeros." He did what Marcus said. The board mocked it, until the numbers turned green again. It should have been a victory, but when the press leaked the story, Meredith pounced. "A homeless teenager manipulating a dying man?" she hissed into cameras. "This is financial abuse, plain and simple." The lawsuits escalated. Staff were replaced with loyalists to Meredith. The butler disappeared one morning. No explanation. Rumors grew louder. Donors pulled support. Protesters lined the mansion gates, signs ranging from "Save the Boys" to "Stop the Madness." Inside the mansion, the real war was psychological. Marcus distanced himself from the others, convinced they'd be sent away any day. Theo lashed out at a housekeeper over a broken brush and didn't come out of his room for 2 days. Ezra stopped eating. Caleb trembled every time the doorbell rang. One night they heard sobbing, muffled, coming from the old music room. Caleb curled into himself under the grand piano, crying so hard he couldn't breathe. "I'm not supposed to be here," he whispered. "I know it. I'm the easiest to send away." Jonathan, frail and pale, walked in slowly. No nurse, no cane, just him. He sat beside Caleb on the floor. "You know what my father said to me when I was your age?" Jonathan asked, voice gravel. Caleb shook his head. "Nothing. He never said anything that wasn't about money." He reached out and took Caleb's hand, thin, bony, warm. "I should have done this years ago. I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." They stayed there for over an hour. No press, no court papers. Just two people, finally not alone. In the days that followed, something shifted. Ezra laughed at one of Eli's terrible jokes. Theo painted a mural on a garage wall. He didn't ask, and no one stopped him. Marcus helped Caleb with math. Jonathan smiled for the first time in a long time, without it hurting. But Meredith wasn't done. She hired a private investigator. She found something she would use, and soon she would tear everything apart. Eli's fingers flew across the keyboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. Beside him, Ezra scanned lines of code on the second monitor, occasionally pointing, occasionally correcting, the twins working in perfect silent synchrony. They were different in temperament. Eli more expressive, Ezra more calculated, but their minds operated like a synchronized machine. What had started as idle tinkering with the company's software architecture turned into something far more serious when they stumbled upon irregularities, unusual financial movements, ghost accounts, delayed filings. It wasn't just corporate negligence. It was a web of deliberate misdirection. The name that surfaced again and again, Alan Voss, Jonathan's former partner. The same man who'd spent the last 2 decades rebuilding his own empire after a quiet split from Crane Global Holdings. Eli and Ezra had no love for corporate politics, but patterns didn't lie. Ezra cross-referenced transactions. Eli built a predictive model. Together, they developed a prototype algorithm that exposed over a dozen suspicious financial behaviors, transactions routed through shells in Belize, laundering cloaked as consulting fees. They presented it to Jonathan on a Tuesday afternoon, projecting the data onto a screen in his study. "He's bleeding the company through subsidiary firms," Eli explained, "and this algorithm predicts which accounts are likely compromised next." Jonathan stared at the screen, then at the boys. His body was weaker now, shaking hands, grey skin, but his eyes still burned. "You're sure?" "Yes," Ezra said. "We triple-checked." Within hours, Jonathan summoned a private meeting with select investors. Within days, news broke. Crane Global Holdings had uncovered a multi-billion-dollar fraud attempt and had taken swift internal action. Alan Voss was denounced in the boardroom and subpoenaed within a week. The company's stock surged. For the first time since the adoption, the narrative shifted. Headlines changed. "Teen geniuses save billionaire's empire." The twins were featured in a tech magazine. A Stanford professor tweeted about their visionary genius. A group of investors offered to fund their algorithm's development into a full-scale application. But recognition, they soon learned, comes at a cost. Alan Voss didn't go down quietly. He held a press conference, calmly accusing the twins of hacking into private servers. He claimed the data was fabricated, the algorithm doctored, and the boys planted to justify Crane's declining mental state. Meredith, seizing the opportunity, echoed his claim. "This wasn't adoption," she said coolly on national television. "It was a reckless social experiment by a dying man, and now it's endangered the reputation of every shareholder involved." Within days, 2 social workers arrived at the mansion, armed with court orders for a psychological welfare review. The staff grew tense. The boys were questioned separately. A psychologist, hand-picked and quietly paid by Meredith's legal team, suggested the environment was highly unstable and that the boys exhibited delusional savior complexes. Jonathan was livid, but his body betrayed him. After a brief court appearance, he collapsed in his private quarters. Panic rippled through the mansion. Paramedics arrived. The media swarmed the gates. Inside, the family, if they could be called that yet, fractured under the weight of fear. "I told you this wouldn't last," Marcus snapped, pacing the foyer, his voice sharp. "This was never real." "We didn't ask for any of this," Theo muttered, arms crossed, avoiding everyone's gaze. "We're being watched constantly," Eli shouted. "Every move we make is a weapon for them." Ezra said nothing, but his face tightened. In the corner, Caleb sat motionless on the staircase, his knees drawn to his chest. "They're going to take us away," he whispered. "I knew it. I knew it." No one noticed Jonathan until he emerged from the hallway, wrapped in a heavy blanket, eyes sunken but burning. "No," he said quietly. "No one is taking you." He sat next to Caleb, pulling the boy close. "You hear me, son? No one. Not while I'm breathing." Caleb trembled against him. "But you're not okay. What if you—" "I'm not okay," Jonathan admitted, "but I'm not dead yet." Something about the word son cracked the silence. Not a dramatic shift, just a flicker of warmth in the frozen air. The next morning, Caleb refused to leave Jonathan's side. He brought him books, made clumsy attempts at soup. When Jonathan coughed through the night, Caleb sat beside his bed with a notepad, sketching chemical compounds and medical symbols from articles he barely understood. He'd made a decision. He would help him live, no matter what. The rest of the house felt different too. Eli and Ezra restructured the algorithm, making it open source in a limited beta form. Theo, restless, disappeared into his art, and Marcus, quiet for once, watched it all unfold with growing conflict in his eyes. But outside, the threat grew. Meredith hired new lawyers. Lobbyists whispered in senators' ears. Rumors spread that the Department of Health was considering full intervention. Meredith planned to frame it as an act of mercy, a removal from an unsafe environment, a chance for the boys to receive proper care. The court date was set. Jonathan was to be re-evaluated for cognitive capacity. A ruling could strip him of legal rights. The boys would be sent back into the system. Jonathan tried to prepare them, but it wasn't enough. The night before the court hearing, the boys stood in the darkened solarium, watching the skyline glow like a distant promise. "They're going to take it all," Marcus said, "and we'll be right back where we started." "No," Caleb said, softly but firmly. "This is different." "How?" Theo asked. "Because he gave us a warm bed and a name?" "Because we care now," Caleb replied. "That's what makes it hurt. We've got something to lose." The next morning they stood behind Jonathan in court, silent, solemn, defiant. But Meredith wasn't bluffing. Her team brought medical charts. "Inconsistent cognition," one doctor testified, "impaired judgment." Emails, carefully selected, painted a picture of erratic behavior. The judge didn't rule that day. The mansion was placed under legal supervision. Access was restricted. Security increased. The boys were told they would be relocated within the week. Ezra punched a wall. Theo locked himself in the garage and painted until dawn. Eli stopped speaking altogether. Caleb disappeared to the library, chasing an impossible idea. And Marcus? He walked into the rain, jaw clenched, hands shaking, and made a phone call to someone he never thought he'd ask for help. They were losing, but the fire had only just been lit. The gallery in Brooklyn was not meant for headlines. It was small, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a worn-down coffee shop where poets still scribbled in notebooks. The opening night wasn't flashy. No red carpet, no champagne fountains, just raw white walls and a quiet invitation list. But the moment Theo's art was unveiled, the world outside couldn't ignore it. The paintings weren't traditional. They bled emotion, thick strokes of shadow and fractured shapes that seemed to whisper pain. One canvas showed a boy curled in a hallway, fists clenched as doors closed around him. Another was a faceless man, drowning in paperwork and coins, a thread of red connecting his chest to a distant child. But it was the legacy that stopped people cold. At first glance, it was an abstract portrait, a lavish estate behind storm clouds, a young girl watching from the shadows as a man signed checks in a blood-colored suit. But hidden within the layers, coded in brush textures and negative space, were scanned, re-rendered fragments of real documents, faded property deeds, partial signatures, wireframe outlines of bank transfers from the 1970s. Theo never said a word about them. He let the paintings speak. The press noticed. An art critic called it a visual scream. A tech blogger decoded one of the symbols and traced it to a dormant company Meredith once controlled. A week later, Reddit exploded with threads linking the paintings to the Crane family's past. Whispers became investigations. The truth began to unravel. Forged permits for properties seized during the financial crisis, bribes dressed as donations, and most damning, a secret offshore fund traced back to their father, used to blackmail rivals into surrendering key assets during the 1980s. Meredith panicked. She tried to buy the entire collection through proxies. She offered Theo a private grant, 6 figures, no strings, if he withdrew the exhibit. He refused. "This isn't about money," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Back at the mansion, still under legal lockdown, Jonathan watched the chaos unfold with a ghost of a smile. He was getting weaker, pale. His hands trembled more each day. But something in him had changed. He stopped trying to defend his past. He started letting it fall. "You were right to paint it," he told Theo. "The truth deserves light." Theo didn't respond. He simply nodded, eyes glassy, then returned to his room to paint another. Meanwhile, Caleb had gone quiet, obsessive. He barely left the private library. Piles of medical journals surrounded him. Handwritten charts cluttered the floor. He had found something, a name in an old publication. Dr. Emery Sloan, a retired immunologist who once proposed a theory on cancer reprogramming through genetic feedback loops. Caleb emailed him. No reply, so he tracked down the man's address in upstate New York and took a risk. He left before sunrise, caught a bus, and knocked on a door with cracked paint and no doorbell. The man who opened it was in his 80s, cautious, gruff. But when Caleb handed him a notebook filled with his handwritten adaptations of Sloane's old theory, the doctor's eyebrows lifted. "You read all this?" "I understood most of it," Caleb admitted. "But I think you missed something back then. You focused on cell death. But what if it's not about killing? What if it's about reminding the body what the cell used to be?" They talked for hours. By nightfall, Sloane agreed to help. He'd been dismissed decades ago, branded a quack. But this kid, this scared, fragile kid, had looked past the ridicule and found the thread. Together, they began drafting an experimental protocol. Nutrigenomic sequencing, memory-triggered immune response. It was theoretical, risky, but it was a start. Caleb returned home to find the mansion's front gates locked. A court officer handed him a letter. Effective immediately, the boys were to be removed and placed under separate guardianship for their own safety. Jonathan was declared unfit to manage care decisions. The world blurred. Inside, Jonathan sat in his robe, silent, eyes glassy from the sedative a nurse had administered earlier. He didn't speak when the boys were escorted out one by one. Caleb screamed, "He's not gone! He's not gone!" A flash of cameras. A police car at the curb, reporters shouting questions. Ezra clutched Eli's arm, trying to keep him from throwing a punch. Theo held back tears behind sunglasses. Marcus stood like a statue, jaw clenched, until the social worker nudged his shoulder. And just like that, they were gone, scattered to different homes. No communication allowed. The mansion, their brief sanctuary, was sealed. Jonathan, in a hospital bed, watched it on TV, alone. The days that followed were a descent into quiet desperation. Theo was placed with a distant foster couple in Jersey, their home sterile, their dinners silent. His paintings were boxed up. They told him not to paint anything dark. He painted only in black. Eli and Ezra were placed together in a youth center, their computers confiscated, their algorithm locked behind a firewall they couldn't breach. Marcus ended up with an old teacher who remembered him, not as a lost cause, but as the kid who used to solve financial puzzles during detention. The man gave him space, internet access, and most importantly, belief. Caleb refused to be placed. He ran. He returned to Dr. Sloan, who, stunned but unable to turn him away, let him stay in the guest room. Every day, Caleb studied, calculated, tweaked the protocol. And then, Jonathan's condition worsened. A judge-approved end-of-life oversight by hospital authority. Meredith released a public statement. This is for his peace, for his dignity. But Caleb wasn't done. He compiled the final version of the treatment plan. He presented it at a medical symposium hosted by a nearby university, sneaking into a student forum under a borrowed ID. He stood on stage, trembling but firm. One by one, experts approached. "Who wrote this?" "I did," he said. "You're 17? "Yes, and my father is dying, unless we try." By the end of the week, a university panel agreed to test the protocol on compassionate grounds. Jonathan's body was nearly gone, but something in him held on. They administered the treatment. Caleb sat at his side, holding his hand. "I told you," he whispered. "I wouldn't let go." 3 days later, Jonathan opened his eyes. Not fully, just a flicker, but it was enough. Across town, Marcus uploaded a dossier. Every shell company, every fraudulent transfer, every private email between Alan Voss and Meredith Crane. It exploded across media channels within hours. The country watched as Meredith Crane, America's corporate darling, was summoned to court. Her face, once synonymous with grace and authority, twisted in front of cameras as evidence mounted. She tried to deny it, then to deflect, then to blame. But it was too late. Her world, the one she built in silence behind closed doors and cold boardrooms, was burning, and this time she had no one left to blame but herself. Marcus didn't sleep the night before the hearing. He sat at the edge of the old sofa in his former teacher's apartment, staring at his laptop screen, cursor blinking over the last line of a report that could detonate the remnants of the Crane empire. He had no legal degree, no fancy suits, no pedigree, but he had the truth, and that had to be enough. In the silence of the early morning, he uploaded the full dossier to a secured public database. The file included Alan Voss's offshore accounts, the confidential emails revealing his collusion with Meredith, and a flowchart Marcus designed himself, detailing the timeline of financial fraud that reached back almost 2 decades. Then he closed the laptop and waited. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Crane insider blows whistle on massive corporate fraud. Marcus declined all interviews. Instead, he packed his single bag and took a cab to the courthouse. Inside, Meredith stood tall, immaculate in black, eyes unreadable. But there was something new in her face. Fatigue. The facade was cracking. Meanwhile, across the city, Eli and Ezra sat in the corner of a shared recreation room, surrounded by the constant buzz of other foster kids. Their computers had been returned under heavy supervision, but they didn't need unrestricted access anymore. They had one mission. "Let's give it to everyone," Ezra said. "The algorithm, no more secrets." Eli hesitated. "Won't that destroy the last of Crane's leverage?" Ezra met his gaze. "We're not Crane's tools. We're us." Together, they published a simplified open-source version of their financial algorithm on GitHub, translating it into accessible modules for universities, NGOs, and independent analysts. Within hours, professors praised it as a revolution in ethical AI finance. Their phones lit up with messages from strangers, from whistleblowers, from journalists begging for comment. But they ignored it all. Their only focus was getting to the courthouse, even if they had to sneak past the social workers. Meanwhile, in a small rented space above a used art supply store, Theo premiered a 10-minute short film titled The Cost of Silence. In it, actors portrayed thinly veiled versions of their experience, 5 foster teens used as pawns in a corporate power struggle, ignored by the very institutions meant to protect them. But it was the ending that shattered viewers. A sequence of real audio clips and still images from shelters, interviews with real teens who had fallen through the cracks. Interwoven were fragments of Meredith's charity gala speeches, cold, distant, full of buzzwords. The film went viral within hours. Suddenly, Meredith Crane was not just a corporate manipulator. She was the face of hypocrisy. Theo didn't wait to hear the applause. He left the building quietly and walked to the hospital. Jonathan had begun speaking again, faint, hoarse, but lucid. The treatment was working. Dr. Sloan called it a miracle. Caleb called it purpose. At the university, a panel of specialists reviewed the protocol. One called it a leap forward. Another said it would redefine compassionate oncology. Caleb didn't care about the accolades. He only cared about one thing: Jonathan lived. So when the court date arrived, the final hearing that would decide Jonathan's legal autonomy and the fate of the 5 boys, they all came. Together, Marcus arrived first in a second-hand suit, carrying a box of printed evidence. Theo followed, paint under his nails. Ezra and Eli entered in matching windbreakers, carrying laptops and quiet fury. And finally, Caleb stood by Jonathan's wheelchair as he was rolled in, thin but upright, his eyes sharp again. Meredith looked at them all, like strangers. The courtroom fell into silence as the proceedings began. The prosecutor detailed Jonathan's alleged incompetency. The defense, bolstered by the new medical report, presented the progress Jonathan had made under Caleb's experimental treatment. Then came the witnesses. One by one, the boys took the stand. Marcus spoke of numbers and survival, of how he once sold food stamps to make rent, and how he now saved $1 billion company. Ezra and Eli described the algorithm and the thrill and fear of knowing they'd built something real in a world that expected them to fail. Theo, asked why he painted the family's secrets, answered, "Because silence doesn't heal anything." And Caleb, the last, said simply, "He saved us first. I just tried to return the favor." Finally, the judge turned to Meredith. She didn't speak. She stared straight ahead, her hands folded tightly. Then the judge read the final ruling. Jonathan Crane's rights were fully restored. The petition for permanent guardianship was denied. The court recognized the 5 adolescents as legally adopted under emergency provisions ratified during Jonathan's brief incapacitation. The gavel hit the wood. The war was over. Meredith stood, shaking. She tried to speak but faltered. Then, with cameras flashing and silence falling, she walked out, alone. Her resignation letter already released to every major network. Jonathan turned to the boys, tears in his eyes. "You gave me something I never knew I wanted, and everything I never deserved." He didn't offer money. He didn't make promises. He just opened his arms, and for the first time, all 5 stepped into them. Later that month, Jonathan signed a document under the golden lights of the city skyline, creating the Crane Foundation for Social Innovation. Ownership was split equally, not between investors, but between Marcus, Eli, Ezra, Theo, and Caleb. He handed each a ring bearing the foundation's seal. Then he turned to face the world once more, this time with his sons at his side. The sun filtered through the wide windows of the mansion, not as a symbol of power anymore, but of rebirth. The old chandeliers had been removed. Velvet curtains replaced with sunlight and open air. The grand staircase no longer led to silent bedrooms, but to vibrant classrooms, rooms alive with the energy of possibility. The Crane Foundation had opened its doors. What was once a fortress of wealth was now a sanctuary for potential. Dozens of teens walked the same marble halls that had once felt like a cage to 5 frightened boys. Now those boys, those brothers, stood at the helm. Marcus took his place first. He had married Leah, a teacher who had once volunteered at an inner-city program he'd spoken at. Their bond grew from long conversations about justice, opportunity, and healing. She challenged him, calmed him. At the foundation, the two co-led the financial empowerment division, offering real-world education on banking, investing, and entrepreneurship for youth who had never held a debit card. Marcus no longer walked with a chip on his shoulder. He walked with purpose. Eli and Ezra launched Sentinel AI, a global initiative spun from their early algorithm. They used predictive data not to enrich hedge funds, but to identify early warning signs of financial instability in developing economies. Universities partnered with them, governments reached out, but they never forgot where they started. Their office in the foundation was minimalist, just 2 desks, a whiteboard, and a handwritten sign that read, "Never above, never below, always with." Theo's art exploded beyond canvas. He was invited to speak at panels on trauma, resilience, and expression. His paintings had been added to the permanent collection at MoMA, but his proudest creation was the art and healing program he built within the foundation, an entire floor where young people explored their own voices, their own pain, through color and shape. Theo didn't wear all black anymore. Sometimes he painted in yellow. And Caleb, sweet, relentless Caleb, received a full scholarship to Johns Hopkins. He still visited the foundation weekly. He helped install a new biomed lab, ran workshops on medical ethics, and never stopped checking on Jonathan, whom he still called Dad without hesitation. And Jonathan, he lived, not cured, but living. The treatment Caleb had pushed forward gave him what doctors hadn't promised. Time. Months passed, then a year. He moved slower, slept more, but every morning he walked the garden paths, watched students run to classes, and knew he had done something that mattered. At the Foundation's official launch gala, they hosted an open event for the community. No red carpet, no private donor booths, just people sitting on the lawn, eating together, laughing, listening. And near the end, Jonathan rose from his chair, helped by Caleb, and stepped onto the stage. He looked older than he ever had, but lighter too, the weight of silence, guilt, and ambition no longer pressing his shoulders down. He looked out at the sea of faces. Then he turned to the 5 young men standing behind him, his sons, and he spoke. "If I had 3 lives, I would live everyone to see this moment. A man can spend his life building towers, but the only thing that truly remains is who you choose to build with. I thought my legacy would be a name carved into buildings or etched on company plaques, but it's here. It's you." He paused, his voice broke. "The legacy we leave isn't what we build, it's who we choose to live through us." Applause filled the garden, tears, laughter, silence. Then, like something out of a movie but entirely real, the 5 brothers embraced him at once. No speeches, no statements. Just an honest, beautiful tangle of arms, shoulders, and memories. And behind them, the foundation stood tall. A new kind of empire, built not from greed, but from grace. The final image, the 6 of them under the open sky, at the heart of something they created together, no longer surviving, now living, now leading, now free.